I think the fear is really about brain drain, right? If you're not optimistic about your country in the long term and you want to move somewhere else, I think that's a really net outflow of talent. This makes it hard for the ecosystem to build. And there are very few countries in the world that actually have a net outflow, right? And to have it for so many years actually continuously is quite an interesting dynamic, especially when there's no war. There's no giant push factor from my perspective. There's a bit of a self-perpetuating cycle here, right? Which is nobody wants to upset this flow, but I just think from a tech ecosystem, I think there's so much more to build in the Philippines. Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, sci-fi nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Mondays for your weekly tech news debate with Shi and Co, managing partner of Hustle Fund. Wednesdays for interviews of regional changemakers covering both the highs and lows of leadership. Fridays for personal diary insights and listener questions and answers. Join our movement of over 12,000 members for transcripts, analysis, and community at www.bravesea.com. Do you manage your own IT for distributed teams in Asia? You know how painful it is. Asavol helps your in-house team by taking tough tasks off their hands and giving them the tools to manage IT effectively. Get help across 8 countries in Asia Pacific, which includes onboarding, procurement, device management, real-time IT support, offboarding, and more. Gain full control of all your IT infrastructure in one place with our state-of-the-art platform. Check out Asavol, ESEVEL.com, and get a demo today. Use our referral code BRAVE for 3 months free. Terms and conditions apply. Good morning. This is going to be such an exciting conversation. Really excited to discuss the Philippines and the market and the future, both the positives and the things that need to improve. Today, Shrey and I will be introducing Mark. Mark, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Mark. I'm the partner running Gen3 Fund. We are Philippines-focused VC fund. We are backed by Anchor LP, the C family. Personal background-wise, I was previously with the Go Ventures team, the Gojek-backed VC fund. And then prior to that as well, I was in the Gojek corporate development team. That saw me take part in the Gojek Series E and Series F fundraising and also was part of the CoinStop.ph acquisition, the team that led the acquisition. So that gave me also initial exposure to the Philippines in terms of the biggest startup exit there to date. And yeah, prior to that, I was in a PE fund for 3 years and in my first year in London in a corporate finance boutique. So been around finance for a bit, but also more generally been around Southeast Asia.
So the reason why we're all here is because we have the tremendous report from Foxmont, Capital Partners, as well as BCG, discussing about the Philippines ecosystem, right? And so I thought this would be a tremendous time to discuss and say, what's our favorite slide or insight from the report? Why don't you start first, Shiyan?
Oh man, my favorite slide is slide 11. Where we have the amazing stat of the 415 digital banks that launched, only 5% are profitable.
Good morning. This is going to be such an exciting conversation. Really excited to discuss the Philippines and the market and the future, both the positives and the things that need to improve. Today, Shrey and I will be introducing Mark. Mark, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Mark. I'm the partner running Gen3 Fund. We are Philippines-focused VC fund. We are backed by Anchor LP, the C family. Personal background-wise, I was previously with the Go Ventures team, the Gojek-backed VC fund. And then prior to that as well, I was in the Gojek corporate development team. That saw me take part in the Gojek Series E and Series F fundraising and also was part of the CoinStop.ph acquisition, the team that led the acquisition. So that gave me also initial exposure to the Philippines in terms of the biggest startup exit there to date. And yeah, prior to that, I was in a PE fund for 3 years and in my first year in London in a corporate finance boutique. So been around finance for a bit, but also more generally been around Southeast Asia.
So the reason why we're all here is because we have the tremendous report from Foxmont, Capital Partners, as well as BCG, discussing about the Philippines ecosystem, right? And so I thought this would be a tremendous time to discuss and say, what's our favorite slide? Or
which I think is a great reminder for anyone who's like, I'm going to start a digital bank. But I think it's great because, FinTech is so hot, just to remind yourself of how hard it is. But they helpfully, this is probably BCG, some poor analyst somewhere had to make this slide, pull out kind of the key factors for what has made them profitable and successful. And so I thought that was like a really good slide around, and it kind of gives you kind of a picture of like, what are the pieces that exist in the ecosystem already versus what are the ones that still have to be built, and what might the challenges be if someone were to approach this problem. And then I think further up, they do talk about the 6 folks who are issued licenses, digital banking licenses in the Philippines, and kind of like walk through those factors. So that was my favorite slide.
How about you, Mark?
Sure. I think it's mainly the general state of the economy and how more startups are getting funded. So there's a very healthy sort of liquidity environment. And naturally, there are headwinds as well, but they did rightly point out that the demographical tailwinds are where the Philippines really benefits. Young population, rising internet penetration, GDP growth was one of the highest in 7.6%, if I'm not mistaken. So pretty strong growth. However, there are headwinds that I think we were missed out, and that is rising inflation. Philippines has about 8.6% inflation rate. There is a gap with the real wage inflation as well. So the real wage inflation is only about 5%. So there's a differential of about 3% where Filipinos are losing. It's crumbling disposable incomes. You have a twin deficit as well, current account and fiscal deficit, which means downward pressure and deflationary pressure on the peso. Overseas Filipino worker population of 10 million, which means that there is peso buying demand and US dollar selling every day. And that happens about 40 billion USD worth of remittances a year. So that also underpins the prevention of the peso depreciating more than a 15% band. So when you think about the macro factors here, very strong tailwinds which are domestic. For the first time ever, you have a presidency that's continuing from the Duterte presidency. The Marcos presidency is really leading off, not uprooting a lot of the trees that Duterte planted, which is the first time because usually you have gaps in the 6-year presidency when you have a changeover. The tailwinds are very fundamentally domestic. The Common Tower Act is another one that is leading to more internet penetration. Smart and Globe are using the same common tower infrastructure, so they don't have to invest in separate towers anymore. However, the headwinds, I think, are not specific to the Philippines. If you think about it, it is very emerging market. Any country in the emerging markets would suffer when the US hike rates and you do not hike rates, right, from an interest rate parity standpoint. I think that's where we get quite excited by the Philippines, because when you have such strong fundamental tailwinds, it leads to potentially good outcomes, at least when we think about growth stage investments.
Well, thanks for I think a very quick summary of I think the bull case, but also I think the bear factors on the macro side, right? And I think that's more full picture about what's going on in the market. For me, I think the 2 favorite slides were actually, I think, a market snapshot of similar to Shiyan, the finance side, but actually the e-commerce players, and that's on slide 13 here. But the part I actually personally, I think, learned the most from was slide 27 to 28. I was talking about the rise of founders beyond the Philippines capital, Manila. I mean, to be frank, I've always traveled to Manila, but I haven't traveled to the surrounding areas, right? And obviously where people live. And so I thought it was just interesting to see them kind of like point out Pet, kind of like Wella, Coloret, and describing cities that I've never visited, right? So I thought it was just interesting to see that. I think you see that dynamic actually across much of Southeast Asia, right? So you see like Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi, and then you see, I think, other cities that are kind of like pick up the entrepreneurial bug. We see that in Indonesia as well, between Jakarta and the different islands, where other folks are starting to build because they can build from anywhere as long as they have internet. But I think it was also realistic because they were quite fair, I would say, in this conversation to say that, hey, if you're out in provinces, you don't have maybe the same talent pool, the same mentorship pool, the same technical training that you're available to get. And I thought it was a pretty fair assessment of the situation. So I really appreciated them pointing that out. So obviously those are our favorite slides from Foxmont. Let's kind of like open the floor, right? So I think one thing I noticed to kind of like broaden out the conversation is there's a lot of positive factors for the Philippines. But I was comparing this to the report from May last year. That was a partnership between IP partners as well as Tech in Asia, right? And I think they felt like there was a lot of stuff that they wanted to be positive about, but also felt like there's a lot more work that could be done in terms of improvements, in terms of branding, regulatory, infrastructure, and talent. So I thought it was an interesting dynamic to be thinking through. Yeah. Mark, what do you think? What do you think the Philippines ecosystem needs more of?
Yeah, sure. No, I think talent is definitely one area that I see a lot of my founders sort of ask or these requests for support on. And specifically here, I'm talking about product manager and growth lead talents. So I often get founders asking me if I have any recruitment leads that I can provide for them for those sort of positions. I think the main reason is because you don't have the local tech giants that you do in Indonesia, for instance. You have Tokopedias, the Travelocas, the Gojeks, which are basing their headquarters in Jakarta itself. So you have PM, talent pools, and cohorts being trained in Jakarta itself. That then leads to more diversity within the ecosystem when they then move on to do their own startups, if not support startups in the ecosystem. I think we lack that a little bit in the Philippines because our tech giants are all regional. So from that context, a lot of the positions are actually based more Singapore-based comparatively to actually being Manila-based. So there is a bit of a lacking cohort of product managers, senior growth lead talents that some of our startups getting to the Series B stages kind of demand and kind of need. So I think that's the biggest gap. From a regulatory standpoint, I would say that, okay, so there are certain sectors that are very well regulated. FinTech is one, and that's why FinTech is proliferated in the Philippines. So there are very clear license categories, right? There's the OPS license for payments, you have the FX license for remittances, the EMI license for mobile wallets, the VSAP license for crypto, and then you have digital banks, right? There's actually 5 categories of banking licenses you can get, and each category has different minimum capitalization requirements, right? So it's all very fully well mapped, right? If you do something out of the map there, you get shut down straight away. So things like, for example, stock trading of US stocks, the reason why there's not been Ajaib or a Bitbit yet is because specifically on the SEC code section 8, it says that Filipino national is not allowed to trade foreign securities, right? So there's very specific things that they really specify in the policies and regulations. That makes it very clear for you to know how to operate, right? Which makes it easier from an investment standpoint and also from an FDI standpoint. The insurance commission is another one that has been very forward thinking. We created an insurance sandbox that allows you basically to act as a managing agent working with an insurance company. And naturally, the entire impetus behind that is that Philippines is at currently 1.2% insurance penetration, right? The global average is 4%. Countries like Japan and Hong Kong are 10%. So there's a long way to catch up, right? And you're not even talking about motor insurance because Philippines, you actually have a mandatory third-party motor insurance. You're talking about things like health insurance and general insurance, right? The consumer education behind that. Are there bank insurance ways for you to distribute through the banking relationship as well? So those are sort of the areas where I think the regulatory side has been quite forward because they have created frameworks for you to operate within and be certain that you can actually operate within. I think by comparison, if you think about the Vietnamese market, sometimes when I was used to cover the market, every lawyer you talk to has a different interpretation, which makes it a bit more complex.
Yeah, that's always a problem with a lot of the emerging markets, right? Is that having that conversation. I think one interesting adjacent on the finance side is that I thought it was quite interesting to learn from the Tech in Asia IP Partners report that in the Philippines, the ESOP stock options taxes are taxable at an exercise point, right? And so they're not deferrable like they would be in the US or in Singapore, but also the gains and the future value of the shares also taxed, and then there's capital gains tax, etc., which I think makes it very difficult, I think, when we talk about PM shortage, etc. It's hard because a lot of the value actually is in the future potential value of the growth in value of the company, right? So I thought it was an interesting problem.
Yeah. So
I know, but I mean, that's good for Singapore as I guess the Delaware of Southeast Asia. But I guess it's interesting actually to see that also another interesting pattern actually. I think I see many startups across the region are doing the same thing of domiciling in Singapore to get around that.
Yeah, I think it's a very common trend. And also when you think about, I think more specific to Philippines, it's more specific to Vietnam, that's the issue when you think about listing entities and things like that, right? So at least you can list a Singapore Holdco. I think the good thing about Philippines, between Singapore and Philippines, is that we have a double tax agreement. So we have a DTA, which means that if you remit money for capital gains from the Philippines, there will not be capital gains tax on you, at least in the Philippines. There will no withholding tax to be specific. And then on the Singapore side, if you're a Section 13 exempt entity, then
hey, Mark, I just want to go back to the talent point. Are you seeing sort of returnees fill some of those roles? Like we're seeing sort of in Vietnam and Singapore and Indo, there's a lot of sort of like, especially the pandemic, bringing people home. So I'm kind of curious what you're seeing in the Philippines.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so one trend you obviously have to double click on when you think about the Philippines is overseas Filipino workers, right? There are 10 million around the world. More specifically, there are 5 million just in California alone. A lot of them are working obviously blue collar jobs, but also white collar jobs, right? You're thinking about nurses, you're talking about doctors in hospitals as well. There is quite a big cohort of Filipino Americans who work in Mountain View, who work in Palo Alto as well. I'm sure Shian, you know a lot of them. So we have encountered quite a few of them. A few of them are building things for home. We're not seeing the same sort of mass cohorts that you're seeing with Indonesians coming back to Indonesia. I think the Indonesian government made a very purposeful effort to bring a lot of the Indonesian talent in Silicon Valley. You know, they look for the talents, right, to bring them back home. But we don't have that in the Philippines yet. So actually, I was talking to Patrick and Eddie about that. We have that for the Philippines, right? But yeah, so that's where I think more effort is put in. And I think the way it happens is more by showing evidence base that you can actually create large companies or sizable outcomes for yourself from the Philippines by doing startups. I think traditionally there's been a bit less of an entrepreneurial mindset in the Philippines compared to the Indonesian market. People tend to like to work for corporates. SM Group is considered a good job to work for after you graduate from university because it's stable, right? And you have very good initiatives like QBO and Idea Space, Katrina Chan, who's creating a very wide diversity and more accessible base for founders to start new things. So I think that's very needed. But you also have, actually after this call, I'm speaking to one of the few guys who angel investors who's investing in the Philippines. So you have the initial group of them coming back. I wouldn't say it's a large cohort.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting theme that I think we're seeing, which is I think the concept of like sea turtles, right? I think Asia Partners report earlier this year kind of like did a big highlight of, and I think it's in itself is actually a copying of the Chinese phrase actually for returning talent. Of course, I think it's hard to discuss this without also talking not just about the stock of returnees, but also the flow of outflow, right? And I think, as you mentioned, like the 10 million diaspora of Filipinos outside is a function of a lot of folks leaving the country, right? Either from their perspective, a temporary basis or trying to be a permanent basis, right? And I think it's an interesting dynamic where it feels like Vietnam, I think, is the other way around. It feels like a lot more returning actually than are leaving to some extent. And then I think Indonesia, I think, never had a tremendous outflow. In fact, I think that's been one of the conversations is that the number of total Indonesian students on exchange or studying in the US actually shrank as a number or stayed flat, even though the economy is much richer and larger. So I think that's kind of like a bit of an elephant in the room, right? Is that I think it's really hard to build a very strong entrepreneurial technology, knowledge first ecosystem when there's a sensation of a brain drain on a net basis.
Philippines definitely suffers from a bit of that because obviously you pay a lot more if you go overseas, right? So being able to sort of show them that you can actually create outcomes that matter in the Philippines that makes a fundamental life difference, I think it's quite important to actually stimulate their return home. Because at the end of the day, if you think about why they moved overseas, it was economically driven, right? It wasn't...
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that I think it's kind of like circular, right, a little bit, which is that it's hard... I think from a policymaker basis is that if you believe a lot of folks are going to emigrate, then are you going to invest in education? Because, the gains of the education go elsewhere, right?
No, this is where the Philippines does actually. So this is where the Philippines has very good vocation. Okay. I wouldn't say good in the sense that I think there's been some complaints about some of the accreditation bodies that I've seen on the news. However, they have very strong accreditation bodies, right? So the nursing schools, for instance, the seafaring schools, for instance. If you go to a cruise ship, a lot of the cruise ship workers are all Filipino. The nurses are all Filipina. In any hospital you go to in Singapore, the major cohort of them are Filipina. So that I think has a very strong show that the education system is actually at a world-class level for you to develop. And these are actually vocational skills, right? I mean, a nurse is someone working on as captain on a cruise ship. So I would say the education system actually does train strong enough people. And even if you look at the white-collar side of things, right, you have the big three universities, and they produce investment bankers. Some of the top people in the country are all from those schools. Even top people working in JP Morgan in Hong Kong. And it's across the board, right? So I would say this Philippines education system, while not being very catered to the mass market, can also be very strong in certain regards because it has been...
Yeah, well, I'm going to debate you on this one, right? I agree with you, actually. I think it's very strong vocational. I mean, Dynamic, for example, some of the biggest maritime training and sailor academies are in the Philippines, right? But I think OECD says that the 15-year-old students in the Philippines scored lower in reading, mathematics, and science, right, on PISA rankings, right, and it's lower than Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, right? So I think it's a really... I think it's true that vocational side, if you want to be a vocational, I think that's there. But then your baseline on your reading, mathematics, and science, right? And you need that to become coders, to be engineers, for STEM, right? For science, right? And I think if you don't do the science, then it's very hard to do deep tech, let alone more than that, right? So looking at software as a service and so on, so forth, FinTech. So it feels like that's the kind of like the dichotomy a little bit, right? Which is I think the diaspora is getting a good education. There's a strong vocational side. But the local education system at least has not yet shown the investment levels yet, right? And outcomes, I think.
In the coding, more developer, IT tech talent. And I think that's also a function of the economy, right? Because there's no SaaS economy in the Philippines. 90% of GDP is consumption at the end of the day. So naturally, you're going to gravitate towards more commerce-driven type outcomes in most things. And actually, when you think about commerce-driven outcomes, then tech may not be the key factor and becomes an enabler, but it's not the key USP anymore. So I think some of that may also gravitate the way some education systems are taught, right? Whether people actually take up developer courses and things like that. However, having said that though, you do have actually quite a strong developer base in the Philippines, especially when it comes to Web3 developers. That's one area where I think that's actually quite a deep talent comparatively to other markets. I've seen a lot of Web3 developers who are based, like you pointed out, there's some activity outside Manila, right? La Union is the one where the Web3 developers are based in.
I think Shi and I previously discussed that one thing we see in the Philippines is that it's not language locked, right? And so it's like, so we use that phrase, we coined that phrase here, it was on very previous episodes, where it was just saying like some countries are landlocked, they don't have a port, so they can't access trade and they don't have benefit from that flow. I think a lot of countries in Southeast Asia are language locked, right? In the sense that they don't speak English, and so they are locked to their local market in terms of knowledge and content, and they kind of use ChatGPT, for example, right? Because I think I've noticed, for example, like this whole ChatGPT, I noticed a lot of my obviously Singaporean but Filipino friends have been one of the earliest adopters of ChatGPT because it's in English, it outputs English, there's lots you can play with, versus I think if you're not English fluent, it's harder for you to play with that technology. Right?
There are some amazing things though. Have you seen Kisan GPT, Jeremy?
No, what's Kisan GPT?
It's an Indian developer who's hooked up GPT also with Whisper, and you can basically talk to it in like, I don't know, 5 or 6 different Indian languages. It's aimed at farmers basically, and it gives you farming advice. So it's really aimed at an illiterate population, so it's totally audio driven with a database of like best practices in terms of farming. And it's actually, I don't know, I was really impressed with the demo. I was like, this is kind of awesome. And there's all these sort of people tagging on to the thread being like, oh, I tested it in Bengali, I tested it in this. And so I think GPT actually opens up a whole new set of use cases and users who might not actually be like formally trained in coding or some of these other things. And so I don't know. I mean, maybe that is to counter you, Jeremy, is like, can you take the Filipinos who are not necessarily coder trained, but who maybe have expertise in business process outsourcing and things like that, and supercharge them with some of these new GPT applications to become more efficient and effective? So.
There's actually already a push away from call center BPO into more data labeling, AI labeling type BPO services already, if you notice. Because people like Risk.ai.
I mean, I think there's a big theme actually is that there's been a tremendous, one of the ways to build like $100 billion business Southeast Asia is labor cost arbitrage, right? So whether there's call centers or data labeling or executive assistants. So definitely see that piece, especially between the Philippines and the US, right? Even though there's so much language fluency and so on and so forth. So looking ahead, what do you think, Mark, is what's your hope and fear, I guess, for the Philippines market? And we'll go around, I guess. Yeah.
Sure. So yeah, I think the first thing first for the Philippines, at least this is a team that my fund is really focused on this year, is really food security. So the Philippines is actually remarkably food insecure. Everything on your plate in Manila is mostly imported. The spoilage rate they call it the Basiacan. Basiacan is the wet market. The spoilage rate between the Basiacan, which is the trading post, which is in the provincial area, to the Basiacan in the Manila area, the spoilage rate can be as high as 40 to 60%, which also explains why margins are so thick for a lot of the middlemen, because you have to account for the spoilage rates. There's a lot of price obfuscation between the different nodes as well, so you don't know the pricing at the trading post nor at the Basiacan as well. It changes every day, which allows middlemen to basically create thicker margins and basically squeeze the farmers as well when you don't plant the right crops. So there's a very big agri-tech problem in the moment in the Philippines because logistics is a problem that leads to wastage. You're bringing down the vegetables in jeepneys. There's a very fragmented trading ecosystem. So most of the tonnage that's demanded by Manila on a daily basis is actually fulfilled through the traditional ecosystem. So you have a bunch of new tech founders trying to do farm-to-table ideas, and actually taking a lot of the learnings from Indonesia to heart as well. I think in Indonesia, when we looked at some of the players there, the margins are a lot thinner, at least when it comes to the distribution layer. If you distribute down to wet markets, I think your margin's only like 4.5% if you on a gross margin basis. If you distribute down like Eden Farms to Horeca B2B, then I think you're closer to like 12, 13%, 14% if you're lucky. In the Philippines, it's as high 20%, 27, 28%. It can go up to 40+% if you optimize for it properly, if you actually know your pricing. So there's a huge market inefficiency there that creates outsized margins, and that's why my fund is actually very, very interested in agri-tech. When we look further upstream, though, there's even deeper problems at the farmer level, because one of the things that happened in the Philippines was the CARP program, the Agrarian Reform Program, and that led to 5-hectare farmer plots, which meant that for individual landowners, you can only own 5 hectares. So the only industrial scale farming you have is 1,000-hectare collectors, which is not really very industrial scale, because that means that you don't have the proper equipment to manage yield and optimize yield. So there is a need to actually sort of consolidate and also sort of better support the farmers. There's not enough financing being given to the farmers as well. Whenever a super typhoon happens, it's a crop failure, which results in a lot of banks not wanting to lend to the agriculture sector. So even though banks are mandated by law to lend 25% of their balance sheet to the agriculture sector, none of them are doing so because they're all paying fines, because it's more economical to pay the fines, just because typhoons can cause massive crop failure. So all this confluence of factors means there's so much you can do in this space, right? Because it's crazy that a 20 million population city can be food insecure, right? And that's a problem for the future, but for right now as well. Most of the meat in Manila is imported. Even pork is imported from Spain because it's cheaper to import pork from Spain, which is a bit crazy, right, if you think about it. Yeah, so I think there's one team that I think we are quite excited by, and also something that we're double clicking on. So we are looking at a couple of startups in the space. We're working with a couple of founders who have plans to digitalize the trading post, for instance, who have plans to do contract farming for another instance, and then also taking the learnings on the Indonesian players and how financing is actually needed to actually do farm to table. If not, the working capital cycle will always kind of kill you, because you have to pay your farmers in T equals 0, and you only get paid from your restaurants in
Well, thanks for answering both, I guess, effectively your fear for the ecosystem and country, but also what the hope is, right? How about you, Shian?
My fears?
Well, one hope on one fear, yeah.
Oh gosh. I mean, I don't know if I have fears, right, other than the standard sort of EM types of like fears, like longer term macro stuff that we cannot really control that much. I think my hope is that I think with the coin's exit and Kumu's growth, it basically like lights the way for more people to build and to build it. I think that's what we need in the ecosystem overall, right? We need more success stories, more exits, more liquidity and recycling of the money and the talent through the ecosystem. And so that's my big hope.
Yeah, I think for me, I think the fear is, I think really about brain drain, right? I just think that if you're not optimistic about your country in the long term and you want to move somewhere else, I think that's a really net outflow of talent. This makes it hard for the ecosystem to build. And I don't think it's solid for any country. I think there are very few countries in the world that actually have a net outflow, right? And to have it for so many years actually continuously is quite an interesting dynamic, especially when there's no war, right? There's no giant push factor from my perspective. Yeah, which drives the FinTech sector.
So it's 10% on GDP, by the way. So it does.
True. So but I think that's why there's like this bit of a self-perpetuating cycle here, right? Which is nobody wants to upset this flow, but I just think from a tech ecosystem, I think there's so much more to build, right? I think in the Philippines.
So yeah. So I think what would be cool is if you go overseas, you learn the talent, and then come back and actually implement that in the home country, right? I think that's what a lot of governments want to see, right? Because then you learn the skill sets needed in the developed country, bring it home. I do see Filipinos do very well in senior management and middle management in countries like Indonesia, in countries like Cambodia, in countries like even Vietnam, where their English skills are actually picked up as being a key highlight of the skill set. Comparatively, I think when you think about more developed countries, they tend to be more vocational skills. So if you take a look at the trend distribution, and that's something that I actually have noticed actually. So if you go to like Jakarta, some of the more senior members in some
and
of
I
the
think that's kind of the hope here, right?
Do.
Is that there are folks who return or folks who are kind of building domestically. But I think what I've noticed is that I think the founders are, I think, very clear about what they can learn from the internet. They can learn from their peers. It's just that I think there's a lot of stuff that you can really learn on the job. You only learn if you've been part of a startup at an early stage. That you only can learn if you actually had a great manager kind of walk you through that process. And so I think that's my hope, is that more of that happens, that more of that on-the-job training, mentorship happens. Yeah, and I think then you can get more well-rounded founders and operators who can do so. And I think I see that. I think there's quite a few founders now who have like I've seen like a lot of Filipino Americans actually kind of like come back to the Philippines, start training, start really focus on talent development. It's kind of really interesting to see that happening. And
But by the way, Jeremy, Philippines is one of the only markets you don't need to be Filipino to actually do very well in. A lot of expats have done very well in the market. It's one of the more remarkably open countries in Southeast Asia for you to do business as an expat. The local guys will actually accept you. There's very little sort of
and that brings to another point that we
sort
talked
of
about in the past
globalization.
was about Asia Partners highlighted the kind of like Rocket Internet talent mafia as one of the training grounds. I think Mark, you have something to share about that.
Yeah, no, so a lot of my good friends are ex-Rocket Network people, right, in the Philippines. I wouldn't say it's a mafia, I'll say that it's a very strong sort of alumni because they don't just keep within themselves, they actually do network with the ecosystem and they do share their knowledge. So yeah, no, I really like talking to them, really like hanging out with them, so yeah, no, it's cool to see the sort of alumni sort of come out and then seed the ecosystem with more ideas, seed the ecosystem with more startups.
Don't forget my buddy Constantine.
And this are all expats, by the way.
Shane, I want to talk about Constantine a little bit about what they're building,
right.
just a 30-second thing, but I think it's something to be said about the broader space here. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Cons is to your point, Mark, a Rocket alum. And I think there's sort of the intersection of like Rocket and the Philippines as well, because he was Zalora and then he was Entrego, which was a logistics solution that was basically all the logistics problems he had at Zalora. He was like, oh, maybe I should try to solve them. And then, was on the team and founder there at Entrego. And then he took that and was like, okay, how can we go bigger with this, with our learnings from both the e-commerce side and the logistics side, and founded Locad. And so they enable brands to grow their e-commerce businesses with scalable and localized fulfillment. So if you think about like, I'm a brand and I need to be in like 3 countries, what is the actual like work that has to get done in order to get my goods into consumers' hands? You have to move the goods. You need to have warehouses to store the goods, but you don't actually know how much you need. So you are either over provisioned or under provisioned as you're trying to estimate like what's going on. And so Locad basically allows you to think about your logistics and your warehouse needs in a sort of flexible, like on-demand way. So it's sort of a software-driven flexible approach to fulfillment and logistics.
Yeah, and that reminds me actually of another company called Shipbaits, led by Josh Supan, which is a YC company. They're building a courier platform for e-commerce, so you can book with multiple couriers on one platform. So I think, but what was interesting, the key insight was that it's just like the Philippines as a country is fragmented into way more islands and more evenly distributed than say Indonesia, right? Which has kind of like more major islands that are more together, right? But and so he just shared like, hey, sure, there's a land logistics network in each island, right, in the Philippines, but actually the big cost is actually the ferry or inter-island travel, right? And I thought it was an interesting piece that he said was like a big obstacle, right, to local domestic shipping charges, but which obviously impacts the local e-commerce market, right, which has historically been one of the fastest growing verticals, right, across Southeast Asia. So yeah, just some interesting insights. Any other thoughts you have about the Philippines?
When are you inviting us over there, Mark? Invite us for a dive trip that we can also discuss startups and investing and all that good stuff.
Sure. So there's a lot of beaches there, right? But there's also quite interesting mountains there as well you can go to. So I was in Baguio the other week. It's really lovely. It's a mountain town. So it's where actually, strangely enough, where the Japanese surrendered to the British after World War II. It was done in Baguio. Interesting, right? But yeah, no, Philippines is very unique. It's very accessible. You're right, Jeremy, there's a lot of islands, but the main island is Luzon, right? So most of the economic activity is Luzon. However, you have Visayas, which is the middle bit of it, and the dispersion there.
Yeah, in terms of travel to the Philippines, I'll probably be going there at least once, if not twice this year. So it'll be interesting. Yeah, I mean, we're looking to confirm the Manila Improv Festival. So,
oh my goodness.
I don't know if you know this, but okay, so improv is an improvisational comedy. It's an art form that was first built in the US and about 100 years ago. And actually what's interesting is that it's emerging in Southeast Asia. It's a hobby of mine. And interestingly, Philippines has the best improv comedy scene in Southeast Asia. I think Singapore is actually a follower of the Philippines. And then Vietnam's only just getting started right now. So it's kind of interesting to see that hobby, right? It be a good example of the cascade of language and culture, right? From America into Southeast Asia as well. Yeah, so go check out SPIT, S-P-I-T. That's probably the best team in the Manila. Looking forward to check out some performances. Okay, I'm plugging improv teams. There we go. But I think is you look ahead, what do you think is one thing you think might potentially come true over the course of the next year?
Well, I think we are in a weird economic situation globally, right? I think a lot of what happens next now depends on what the Fed does. So I think some of the employment rate numbers are still quite healthy. So I think that the room for them to cut the interest rates still is there, and inflation is still quite high. I think that the implication is that, or the kind of general consensus is that they are still going to hike interest rates a little bit more by 50 basis points or whatnot. That's general consensus. So as a result of which, Philippines has to hike interest rates as well, right? Because if not, your peso is just going to depreciate. There's going to be outflows back to the US, right? Just because of the interest rate parity, right? So because of that, I think that the rest of the year is going to be quite an interesting scenario for the Philippines, where you have a lot of pent up demand, post-COVID pent up demand, young population pent up demand, but at the same time as well, they're going to look at the prices and going to see, oh yeah, the price of pork has increased, right? You have weird things like in the Philippines that the price of onions increased 400% in 1 week and then dropped the next week because, like I said, the Philippines is food insecure. People are hoarding onions because they import onions, right? So people are going to experience that. I think that is the what's going to happen to the Philippines because of the headwinds. But then once those headwinds start to dissipate, once the US starts to take a bit more of a expansionary monetary policy, and then once they start to roll back, which I think Howell has started to even talk about, right? I think that would be then the impetus in 2024 for the Philippines to really pick up again in terms of, so there would be some degree of muted sort of consumption growth in this rest of the year because of the headwinds externally. But I think in 2024 is the year where the Philippines will really spread the wings, and then some of the growth equity investments that we started seeing in 2021, 2022 will start happening again at the BC stages, at the D stages, when people start to be a bit more happy about
on that note, thank you so
growth
much for coming to the show. Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.